Emile Griffith was gentle outside the ring, but inside, he carried grudges that could kill.
Welterweight championship at stake.
They called him the Hurricane from the Virgin Islands, a soft-spoken hat designer who transformed into a lethal assassin when the bell rang. But beneath that quiet Caribbean demeanor burned fires of hatred that consumed him for decades. Throughout his legendary career, Griffith didn't just fight opponents, he battled demons that went far deeper than boxing rivalries. We're talking about personal attacks on his identity, cultural slurs that cut to his soul, and words that crossed lines no human being should ever cross.
A minute to go!
These weren't just disagreements about who deserved title shots. These were vendettas that destroyed lives, ended careers, and created guilt that lasted lifetimes. From cultural clashes that split the boxing world to personal attacks that questioned his very existence, Griffith's career was shaped by enemies who pushed him beyond his breaking point. Some rivalries ended in victory, others in defeat, but one ended in tragedy that haunted him until his dying day. Today, we're counting down the 6 boxers that Emile Griffith despised the most. The hatred and heartbreak you're about to discover will shock you. This is boxing's darkest side, raw, unfiltered, and absolutely devastating. 6. Luis Rodriguez. Coming in at number 6 is a rivalry that defined an entire era. Luis El Feo Rodriguez, the Cuban exile whose 3 brutal encounters with Griffith turned their welterweight wars into a personal vendetta that consumed both fighters' careers. Here's what supposedly went down behind the scenes. Rodriguez and Griffith first clashed in 1960, with both fighters representing different Caribbean cultures and fighting philosophies. But according to sources close to both camps, Rodriguez never respected Griffith's Virgin Islands background, reportedly telling Cuban media that Griffith was just another American pretending to represent the islands, and that his success came from fighting in a weak division. The breaking point supposedly came before their second encounter when Rodriguez reportedly dismissed Griffith's heritage, saying he was too Americanized to understand real Caribbean boxing, and that Cuban fighters had more heart than any tourist island could produce. Griffith, deeply proud of his Virgin Islands roots, reportedly fired back that Rodriguez was a bitter exile who'd never amount to anything meaningful, and that he'd send him back to Miami crying. What made this feud particularly intense was the cultural element combined with their contrasting styles. Rodriguez represented Cuban boxing tradition and technical precision, while Griffith embodied Virgin Islands power and American professional training. Training camp sources claim both fighters became obsessed with proving their island's boxing superiority, with Rodriguez reportedly telling sparring partners that Griffith's style was crude American brawling, and Griffith supposedly calling Rodriguez's approach outdated Cuban schoolboy boxing. Their trilogy became more than just fights. It was a cultural war that lasted years, with each victory representing national pride and each defeat demanding immediate revenge. 5. Dick Tiger. Coming in at number 5 is the rivalry that split continental boxing fans down the middle. Dick the Fighting Machine. Tiger, the Nigerian warrior whose African boxing royalty supposedly clashed with Griffith's Caribbean craftsmanship in a feud that went beyond professional rivalry. Here's what supposedly went down behind the scenes. Throughout the mid-60s, Tiger was being hailed as Africa's greatest boxing export, while Griffith was establishing himself as a legitimate middleweight threat. But according to sources close to both camps, Tiger never took Griffith seriously as a middleweight contender, reportedly telling British media that Griffith was just a blown-up welterweight who didn't belong with real middleweights. The breaking point supposedly came during a London press conference when Tiger reportedly told Griffith he represented American commercial boxing, while he embodied pure African warrior spirit, and that Griffith's success came from fighting hand-picked opponents instead of real champions. Griffith, never one to tolerate being dismissed, reportedly fired back that Tiger was an overrated foreign fighter who'd get exposed by real American competition. What made this feud particularly compelling was the cultural and philosophical clash. Tiger represented traditional African boxing discipline and warrior mentality, while Griffith embodied Caribbean technique mixed with American professional training. Training camp sources claim both fighters studied each other obsessively, with Tiger reportedly telling sparring partners that Griffith's defense was too American and predictable, and Griffith supposedly calling Tiger's style one-dimensional African brawling. Their encounters became more than championship fights. They represented continental pride, with African boxing fans rallying behind Tiger while Caribbean and American supporters backed Griffith in battles that showcased two completely different approaches to the sweet science. 4. Nino Benvenuti. Coming in at number 4 is the rivalry that exposed boxing's international politics. Nino the Trieste Tiger. Benvenuti, the Italian golden boy whose European boxing aristocracy supposedly clashed with Griffith's blue-collar Caribbean approach in a feud that divided continents. Here's what supposedly went down behind the scenes. Benvenuti was being positioned as European boxing's next great superstar, while Griffith was viewed as a tough American professional standing in his way. But according to sources close to both camps, Benvenuti never respected Griffith's fighting style, reportedly telling Italian media that Griffith represented primitive American boxing compared to his refined European technique. The breaking point supposedly came during their pre-fight promotional tour when Benvenuti reportedly dismissed Griffith's accomplishments, saying that American boxing was commercially driven, while European boxing maintained pure sporting tradition, and that Griffith's victories came from fighting inferior competition. Griffith, proud of his professional achievements, reportedly fired back that Benvenuti was a protected European pretty boy who'd never faced real competition, and that he'd expose him as an overrated amateur. What made this feud particularly bitter was the clash between European amateur tradition and American professional excellence. Benvenuti represented old-world boxing elegance and technical perfection, while Griffith embodied new-world power and practical effectiveness. Training camp sources claim both fighters took the cultural elements personally, with Benvenuti reportedly telling sparring partners that Griffith's approach was unsophisticated and brutal, and Griffith supposedly calling Benvenuti's style fancy European dancing that wouldn't work against real fighters. Their battles became more than title fights. They represented different boxing philosophies, with European fans celebrating technical mastery while American supporters favored practical effectiveness in encounters that split international boxing opinion for years. 3. Jose Napoles. Coming in at number 3 is the rivalry that politics and promotional warfare kept from reaching its explosive potential. Jose Mantequilla Napoles, the Cuban technique master whose supposed superiority complex turned their avoided confrontation into a decade-long war of words that consumed both fighters. Here's what supposedly went down behind the scenes. Throughout the late 60s and early 70s, both fighters were dominating the welterweight division from different promotional stables. But according to sources close to both camps, Napoles never gave Griffith credit for his longevity and achievements, reportedly telling Mexican media that Griffith was a faded champion living off past glory, and that his recent victories came from fighting carefully selected opponents. The breaking point supposedly came during a heated promotional meeting when Napoles reportedly dismissed Griffith's legacy, saying he represented old-school American boxing that was already outdated, while he embodied modern Cuban technique that would dominate the future. Griffith, still confident in his abilities despite advancing age, reportedly fired back that Napoles was an untested Cuban who'd never beaten a real champion, and that he'd school him like the pretender he was. What made this feud particularly frustrating was the missed opportunity element combined with cultural pride. Napoles represented evolved Cuban boxing technique and ring intelligence, while Griffith embodied battle-tested Caribbean power and championship experience. Training camp sources claim both fighters became obsessed with proving their superiority, with Napoles reportedly telling sparring partners that Griffith's style was prehistoric and predictable, and Griffith supposedly calling Napoles' approach flashy Cuban showboating without substance. The animosity intensified when promotional politics and network conflicts prevented their superfight from ever materializing, leaving both fighters with unfinished business and fans forever wondering who would have emerged victorious in what could have been the welterweight fight of the decade. 2. Carlos Monzon. Coming in at number 2 is the rivalry that exposed the cruelest truth about boxing. Carlos Escopeta Monzon, the Argentine destroyer whose devastating power and supposed disrespect toward Griffith's aging legacy created a feud that ended one of boxing's greatest careers. Here's what supposedly went down behind the scenes. By the mid-70s, Monzon was being hailed as the middleweight division's unstoppable force, while Griffith was viewed as a faded legend, desperately trying to reclaim past glory. But according to sources close to both camps, Monzon never showed Griffith the respect due a former champion, reportedly telling Argentine media that Griffith was a washed-up old man who didn't belong in the ring with real middleweights. The breaking point supposedly came during their pre-fight press conference when Monzon reportedly made cruel comments about Griffith's age and diminished skills, saying he was embarrassing himself by fighting past his prime, and that their bout would be more like a public execution than a real fight. Griffith, still proud despite his advancing years, reportedly fired back that Monzon was an overrated South American bully who'd never faced real championship-level competition, and that experience would overcome youth. What made this feud particularly heartbreaking was the generational clash combined with Monzon's supposed cruelty toward a fading legend. Monzon represented new-age Argentine boxing power and ruthless efficiency, while Griffith embodied old-school Caribbean technique and championship heart. Training camp sources claim Monzon took pleasure in humiliating the aging Griffith, reportedly telling sparring partners that the fight would be target practice, and Griffith supposedly knowing deep down that he was facing an impossible task, but refusing to back down from the challenge. When they finally met in the ring, Monzon's devastating performance wasn't just a victory, it was a brutal reality check that ended Griffith's championship dreams and forced him to confront the harsh truth that time defeats every fighter. The aftermath left Griffith questioning whether he should have retired years earlier, adding psychological scars to his physical beating that lasted long after the final bell. Number 1. Benny Parrott. Number 1 is the most tragic and haunting rivalry in boxing history. The Cuban welterweight whose homophobic slurs and personal attacks on Griffith's identity created a feud that ended in unspeakable tragedy and lifelong guilt. Here's what supposedly went down behind the scenes. Parrott and Griffith had already fought twice when their trilogy was arranged, with tensions escalating beyond normal boxing rivalry. But according to sources close to both camps, Parrott had discovered rumors about Griffith's personal life and decided to use them as psychological warfare, reportedly making homophobic comments and questioning Griffith's masculinity in ways that crossed every line of human decency. The breaking point supposedly came during their final weigh-in when Parrott reportedly called Griffith a homophobic slur in front of cameras and grabbed his buttocks, humiliating him in front of the boxing world while making disgusting comments about his sexuality. Griffith, visibly shaken by the public humiliation and deeply hurt by the personal attack on his identity, reportedly told cornermen that Parrott had gone too far and that he would make him pay for every word. What made this feud particularly devastating was how personal and cruel Parrott made it. This wasn't professional rivalry. Parrott attacked Griffith's deepest insecurities and most private struggles in an era when being different meant facing societal hatred. Training camp sources claim Griffith became consumed with rage unlike anything they'd ever seen, reportedly telling anyone who'd listen that Parrott had crossed lines that could never be forgiven, and that their fight was about more than boxing. It was about respect and dignity. When they finally met in the ring for the third time, Griffith's devastating combination in the 12th round wasn't just about winning a fight. It was about defending his honor and humanity against someone who had tried to destroy him psychologically. The tragic aftermath, when Parrott died from his injuries, left Griffith carrying guilt that consumed him for the rest of his life, forever wondering if his anger over those horrible words had contributed to a man's death, and questioning whether revenge was ever worth the ultimate price. Emile Griffith's heart carried more than boxing victories. It held the weight of tragedy, the burden of guilt, and the scars of words that cut deeper than any punch. These feuds proved that some rivalries transcend sport and become matters of life, death, and human dignity. Which rivalry affected boxing history the most? Smash that like button, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more boxing's most powerful stories.